Hey everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome to January 2020, where we are about to take up what I think will be a pretty neat public forum resolution. Resolve: the United States should end its economic sanctions against Venezuela. If you're new to the channel, Hail State Debate is all about helping PF and LD debaters across the country be the best they can be, kind of combining the practical side of things with a little bit of understanding of how debate theory works. It's for everybody, whether you're from a big program in a big state or a small program or no program, you're out there debating on your own. We want it to be useful to everybody. If it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, keep up with our general thoughts on debate and on topic selection, we are at Hail State Debate. As always, the sources we cite will be below in the notes, as will the timestamps for the different sections of the video. You may have noticed we are not in the studio this month, the brand new studio that we have, the fancy one over there. That's because despite having a lot of help preparing for the video, I am the only person on campus during the break, so I'm the only person in the video. I didn't think it was worth opening it up, but we will be back over there next time if you like the new professional look. So without further ado, our topic this month takes us to Venezuela, a beautiful and once prosperous place, now alas beset with corruption, violence, and poverty. But not to fear, your friendly neighborhood superpower, the U.S., is happy to step in and restore order, democracy, and most of all, capitalism through the tool of economic sanctions. What could possibly go wrong? I've got to say, in terms of thoughts on this resolution, I like it a lot. I think it's very versatile. I think there are a lot of specific arguments. I think it's very practical. A few general thoughts before we get into the particulars. I think it's a topic where the specific is going to beat the general, right? I think the more you learn about the specifics of the domestic political situation in Venezuela, the specifics of how the sanctions work, the specifics of how Russia and, for example, China are becoming involved, the day-to-day brass tacks, practical stuff, the better off you'll be. Yes, there are big articles out there on theoretical grand strategy, on soft power, on hegemony, that kind of stuff. Absolutely read that. We'll certainly link to some of it, but also just read the news, right? Read Bloomberg, read Reuters, read The Economist. Develop a very practical understanding that you can explain to any judge, whether they're experienced or a lay judge or community judge or whatever, right? I think on a related note, this is a topic where you can out-current your opponent, right? Things change from day to day. The situation is evolving right now, for example, with China and Russia's involvement in actually taking over oil field operations. We're seeing the popularity of the opposition and Juan Guaido decline. And so you may very well be able to look up a source on Thursday that helps you win on Friday. So just keep up with the particulars. That's always a good idea. But on a still evolving topic like this one, I think it's very important. I will say, I think the topic leans a little bit to the pro. It's a little bit of a pro topic, if you will, but not too heavily. I think it's kind of asymmetrical. And we see this on a lot of resolutions where there ends up being even ground, but in different ways, like different approaches, right? I think the pro has the ability to hit hard on a lot of the big core issues, has, I think, the better of the argument on things like the potential ineffectiveness of the sanctions, both just economic sanctions as a general matter and sanctions in Venezuela specifically. I think the pro has the better argument on harming the Venezuelan people and potentially on harm to the United States, right? But the con has some very strategic ground because the pro arguably, depending on the framing of the resolution, has a lot of different sanctions it has to attack. As we're going to see in just a few minutes, there are, close to a dozen different specific sanctions that are in place by the United States against Venezuela right now. And while some of them are highly controversial, not all of them are. Like some things like narcotics trafficking or sanctions against specific members of the Maduro regime. If those are topical, if those fit within the framing of the resolution, they're a lot harder for the pro to attack. And if that comes within the pro's burden, if the con can show you've got to get rid of those as well, then the pro's going to have a tough time. So I think the framing fight is actually going to be really important on this. And I think at the end of the day, it ends up being a fairly even topic, albeit in different ways for the different sides. I will say really quickly before we move on, there is one mandatory source I want to give you at the very top of the video, just in case this is the only thing you watch. Hopefully it's not, watch the whole video. But that's going to be the Weisbrot and Sachs article from the Center for Economic and Policy Research from 2019. It's called Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. This is just a fantastic article that, number one, chronicles the harm to the Venezuelan people that has occurred in the last couple of years economically and politically, but also makes a strong case for the idea, like an empirical case, not just logical, but database case for the idea that U.S. sanctions are making it worse. It's 25 pages long and you just need to read it, right? It is the single best source on the subject. It does help the pro overwhelmingly. Weisbrot is a big supporter of the regime down there, so he does have his biases. But at the end of the day, it is a fantastic source that everybody needs to read. So with that, let's jump right into it. Let's first of all do a historical overview. That's extremely important on a very practical, real world based topic like this. So we'll do that. Then we'll move on to framework, which is also important, particularly on this topic, and then pro and then con. So without further ado, let's talk about some history. Okay, so let's start with some general historical background on how Venezuela got to where it is today, and then we'll move on and talk about the specifics of what each one of the particular sanctions by the U.S. does, okay? So I think that it's fair to start the story back in World War I, when Venezuela discovered massive oil deposits in its territory. And since then, Venezuela has generally been one of the wealthiest, most developed, most prosperous countries in South America. Now, it's wavered back and forth between democratic rule and a more sort of oligarchic autocracy, but generally speaking, the country has settled into a functioning democracy in the 1970s, right? But there's a problem. When you put all your eggs in one basket, you have to watch that basket. And because of oil wealth, Venezuela became heavily dependent on oil and nothing else for the vast majority of its country's prosperity, right? That's what made it rich. That was the sole source for a lot of this growth. But in the 1980s, oil prices collapsed, right? And other factors coincided to basically send Venezuela into an economic tailspin. Now, that wasn't the end of the road for Venezuela. Prices go up and down, oil fluctuates, and they went back and forth, up and down. But generally speaking, in the late 80s and early 90s, you started seeing social discontent, protests, clashes with the government because the government wasn't able to fund social programs, social spending the way it had been before, right? Now, while all of this was going on, this general discontent that the country was less prosperous because of declining oil prices, there was a revolutionary movement that called itself the Bolivarian movement, after Simon Bolivar, that found a lot of support in Venezuela generally, but particularly in the Venezuelan military, including a particularly radical adherent, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez. I'm sure you know that name, right? To make a long story short, after a failed coup attempt against the government in 1992, Chavez won the presidential election in 1988, and he began a series of what you would sort of call socialist/extreme populist reforms designed to distribute the spoils of oil wealth more equitably among the Venezuelan people. Not just the wealthy and connected and the affluent, but everybody basically gets a share, right? Now, let's be clear. Chavez's rule was very chaotic, right? He himself was deposed by a coup and returned to power after massive protests. His electoral victories were marred by credible accusations of fraud. There was even a referendum to completely rewrite the Constitution under him, right? But what he did do was sort of follow the traditional hardcore progressive socialist populist playbook. He did the things he said he was going to do eventually. He implemented massive increases on social spending that did, to his credit, significantly reduce poverty. But he also put price caps on essential goods like food. He fully nationalized the already partly nationalized oil industry in the country. He redistributed land from the wealthy to the poor. He nationalized many industries, construction, electricity, telecom. He raised taxes on the rich, right? And Chavez died of cancer while in office in 2013, and his vice president Nicolas Maduro took over, right? But around this time was when the whole, what we would call Chavista, Chavista socialist experiment really kind of started to unravel. And let me explain why. Venezuela had been partly immune to some of the economic restraints that generally affect socialist reforms in these sort of mid-level countries. In other countries, when you start doing things like massive tax increases, massive spending increases, nationalizing countries, seizing land, you end up becoming, impoverished quickly because capital, like the owners of capital, decide, well, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I'm going to take my ball and go home. I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to another country. International investors stop doing that, right? But Venezuela was a little bit different. It could hang on a little bit longer because remember, its wealth is based on oil, right? And the oil is in the ground and you can't just leave and take it with you. So essentially, it was able to continue being relatively prosperous for a longer time than other countries who've tried similar experiments, right? But here's the problem. When you put all your eggs in one basket, again, you're subject to the whims of how that basket performs, right? And here the basket is oil. By roughly 2014, global oil prices were in free fall. And this was partly due to the United States opening up vast new reserves due to fracking and things like that, right? But global oil prices are going down and the government of Venezuela is not cutting spending, right? And at this point, you're starting to see an economic crisis. You're starting to see inflation. You're starting to see shortages and things like that, right? And opposition party members tried to say to the Maduro government, hey, we're having a massive economic crisis. Maduro, you need to do something about it. And so Maduro says in response, okay, fair enough, I'll do two things. First of all, I'll deny that the economic crisis is happening. And second, I'll send some paramilitary squads to kill you guys. And he did both of those things. There were thousands of extrajudicial killings of critics, of opponents of Maduro in 2014 and 2015. And in response to this, and this is not the true beginning of the sanctions, we'll talk about those later, but this is when the big ones started to kick in. So in response to this, the U.S. Congress passes a statute called the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act that allows for like travel bans and asset freezes, like freezing their international assets for any Venezuelan officials involved in human rights abuses, right? So that is the first big sanction that we see against the Maduro regime, particularly. Meanwhile, the economy continues to collapse. There are shortages of food, medical supplies, and other necessities. They're growing by the month. The government continues to refuse to cut spending. It keeps printing money, which leads to those of you who've taken an basic economics class to inflation and hyperinflation. Basically, there's so much money in the system, prices go up dramatically, your savings become worth almost nothing, money becomes worth almost nothing, right? And by 2017, because of the free fall that the economy still was in, the opposition party had won a majority in the National Assembly. So what did Maduro do? Well, like any good aspiring dictator, he just disavowed it. He said, this is not a legitimate assembly, and he packed the Supreme Court with his loyalists. Now, in response to that, right, the Trump administration implemented an executive order 13808. Or EO 13808, which bars Venezuela from having access to U.S. financial markets. Now, this is going to be really important for reasons we'll discuss in just a second, but it accelerated the recession, right? Because it kept Venezuela from having access to refinancing its debts, right? What Venezuela wanted to do is go to U.S. banks, go to Wall Street, and basically get a new loan, like an extension on the debt, the massive debts that it already had. But because of this executive order, it couldn't do that, which led to a even faster decline of the economy, massive power outages, massive shortages of everything, because basically Venezuela couldn't get a loan to keep the lights on, in so many words, right? So here again, after this, there were massive protests, and Maduro was calling for a new constitution. Many people saw this as his effort to basically change the rules and let him stay in power for life. He ended up calling an early presidential election in 2018. Many candidates on the opposition side were not prepared. Many organizations were banned from participating. The election was universally condemned as a sham, but he remains in power to this day. Now, in November 2018, the Trump administration implemented kind of the second major tentpole sanction here, which was Executive Order 13850, which bars U.S. entities from transacting with Venezuela's state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., which we're going to call for the rest of this video PDVSA. PDVSA is the state-owned oil company. This was phased in, but by 2019, U.S. entities, U.S. companies were fully banned from transacting or buying oil or in any way interacting with PDVSA, which is basically the bulk of Venezuela's economy, right? Now, the stated purpose of this sanction and other major sanctions, according to the Trump administration, according to its own press releases, is to get Maduro to step down. That's the objective here. That's what we're talking about. Getting Maduro out is the stated goal for two reasons. Number one, because he's not a legitimate democratically elected president. And number two, because his rule has harmed the people of Venezuela. Both of those statements are true, but later on we're going to talk about whether the United States is really credible when it says that these are our reasons for doing it. Anyway, these sanctions were incredibly devastating for Venezuela's economy, since, again, it relies overwhelmingly on oil exports to pay for almost everything it imports. Food, medicine, clothing, you name it, they pay for it with oil. So if they can't get a loan to keep the oil company running, and now they just can't sell the oil to the United States at all, which is a huge customer, they're hurting really badly, right? And as we'll discuss later, since the outset of the economic collapse in 2014, right, things have gotten much, much worse in Venezuela, right? Money is so inflated that it is basically worthless. Food is scarce. Malnutrition is rampant. People have lost just huge amounts of weight, literally losing weight. Medical supplies are non-existent. Mortality and infant mortality rates are skyrocketing. Millions of people are fleeing the country as refugees. Now, for context, you need to understand this is a truly scary and remarkable thing. Venezuela was not like South Sudan, right? This was a developed country. Not developed like the United States or the UK, but in many ways a lot like an Eastern European country, a lot like Mexico, a lot like parts of China. To see it collapse into what is bordering on maybe becoming a failed state, right? To see a refugee crisis, to see people who literally can't eat is a genuinely shocking thing, right? But, and this is an important but, since the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Maduro soon found a trusty ally in Vladimir Putin in Russia. The Russian state-owned oil company, Rosneft, has stepped in to purchase huge quantities of Venezuelan oil, effectively giving them a lifeline. Russian troops are now stationed in Venezuela, embedding themselves with Venezuelan military units, and Russia is even looking at opening up an AK-47 factory to supply them there. So there is a real fear that even though these sanctions have really hit the country hard and really accelerated the decline of the economy, that it just wasn't enough, that Maduro has endured the worst of it, and now he has an ally, and now he has a lifeline, and that we can keep these things in place, but it's only going to hurt the regular citizens because he's basically going to be able to hang around. And that's where we are today. So the question becomes, what exactly do we do? So having looked at the basic, really quick outline of history, we now need to do an inventory of what exactly these sanctions are and how they work. Okay, so understanding what the different sanctions do is going to be really important because they're not all the same. They have different effects on the Venezuelan people. They have different time frames, different goals, right? And you don't want to go into a round in a fog, kind of lumping them all together. You might even want to think about maybe making a cheat sheet for yourself that kind of lays these out. If you want a good summary, you can look to the Congressional Research Service summary from October of 2019. I think that's kind of the authoritative statement from a very credible source as to what the different sanctions are. But we'll just go in chronological order, starting off with some of what I think are maybe the less important ones and then moving to some of the more important ones. So first, chronologically, would be the Arms Export Control Act Section 40A sanctions. These have been in place since 2006, and they exist for not fully cooperating with U.S. anti-terrorism efforts. What they do is prohibit U.S. arms transfers and retransfers to Venezuela. They also have some financial sanctions on a couple of Venezuelan individuals and a couple of companies. Candidly, I don't know that this was what the topic committee was focused on, but there is going to be an argument, as we'll see later, that this could be defined as an economic sanction. And the question would be, does the pro have to go after this in order to meet their burdens under the resolution, or do they not, right? The second one chronologically also comes from 2006, and this will be drug-related sanctions under the Foreign Relations Authorization Act. These were renewed in 2019, as were the arms control sanctions. Both were renewed in 2019. And what these do is they freeze the assets in the United States of certain key individuals involved in drug trafficking, as well as certain Venezuelan companies. And this is important because many of these individuals are highly connected to the Maduro regime. In fact, some of them hold high posts within certain government agencies and were appointed or put in their positions by Maduro. And there's a strong allegation that there's a deep connection between these cocaine cartels and the Maduro regime itself. One side supports the other, and the other, basically you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, right? So again, an argument can be made that this is in fact topical. We'll see how that plays out later on. The third one, and I think sort of now getting into kind of the more core sanctions, would be targeted human rights sanctions under the Venezuelan Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act. This was passed by Congress in 2014 following the extrajudicial killings and the other unrest that we talked about a little bit earlier. I maybe just call it the Human Rights Act just because it's such a long name. But basically what this does is it, again, uses asset freezes and travel bans, denying visas, things like that, to individuals that were involved in the human rights abuses, the extrajudicial killings. This ranges from, for example, judges, prosecutors, high-ranking government officials. Here again, the con might say these are economic because they are asset freezes. They apply to Venezuelan government officials. Why should we get rid of these? What's the harm of having these in place? So that'll be interesting to talk about later. And these have also been extended as recently as 2019. Now, after that, we start getting into the very, very core of kind of what the major sanctions are, I think, in the resolution, and they all come in the form of executive orders from the Trump administration. So I'm going to give you the numbers on them, and you probably will want to keep up with the specific executive order numbers just to know and distinguish between which one you're talking about. So the first one from August of 2017 is Executive Order EO 13808. This is the one that bans Venezuela's access to financial markets in the United States. You can't go to investment banks. You can't go to Wall Street. This was critical because Venezuela is deeply in debt. Most countries are in debt, but Venezuela is deeply in debt because of its financial crises and economic crises. And they badly wanted to be able to refinance that debt and basically get it extended by getting someone to loan them some money. Well, by taking away the biggest financial market in the world in the United States, the U.S. government has crippled their ability to do that. Worse for Venezuela is the fact that U.S. financial markets are so intertwined with other financial markets, like bond buyers typically are large international consortiums of companies from different places. And if even one of those bond buyers is a U.S. company, because this applies to all U.S. companies, that means that the bond buyers collectively are not going to be able to refinance Venezuela's debt. And there's a complicated explanation of that. I'm going to put some links in the notes that kind of explain how this works, right? But the long and the short of it is, when the United States financial market is not accessible to you, when U.S. companies can't buy your debt and can't give you a loan, basically, what that means for practical purposes is that much of the rest of the world is going to back off as well, because they're so inextricably tied to the U.S. financial market. They don't want to risk getting sanctioned, and in many cases, they're partnering with U.S. companies who can't do the deal, right? So this goes well beyond not just being able to get a loan in the United States. It really impedes the ability of Venezuela to get a loan in anywhere in the world. And what that effectively means is that they have difficulty buying basic necessities, right, like food and medicine. And they also have difficulty getting the money to keep things like the state-owned oil company running. So this is a very, very important sanction. The next executive order will be sanctions on particular economic sectors. This is Executive Order 13850 from November 2018. These are going to be bans on transactions and asset freezes for certain sectors of the Venezuelan economy that the Secretary of Treasury determines to be complicit in corruption with the Maduro regime. It started with the gold mining sector because the state gold mining company was involved in a corruption scheme with Maduro where it funneled money to him. But much more important than that was, in January of 2019, the Treasury Department extended this sanction, extended this ban on transactions in the U.S. to the state oil industry, to PDVSA. Remember, this is the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy. This is the source of a huge percentage of the revenues it uses to buy things like food, to buy medicine, and things along those lines. And what this executive order does is prevent U.S. companies from doing business with the state-owned oil company. Later on, the executive order would also be extended to things like state banks and others. But by far the most important part of it is going to be the ban on the U.S. buying oil from Venezuela. The last executive order will be the specific sanctions on the Maduro government. This is EO 13884 from August 2019, and this bars U.S. entities from basically any kind of transaction of any kind with the Maduro government or any agency or any company or any entity operated by the Maduro government unless the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, allows it. This is just going to be a blanket ban on doing business with most parts of the Venezuelan economy if you are a U.S. company. This is going to dramatically restrict the ability of Venezuela to get basic necessities and things along those lines. There are exceptions to this for things like food and medicine, but the problem is, as we'll discuss later, because these sanctions collectively constrict the economy so much, even if Venezuela is allowed to buy food and medicine, right, they have so little money because their oil sales have dried up so much that it's very difficult to be able to go out and buy it even if you're allowed to do it. So those are the major sanctions against Venezuela. You're going to want to make sure that you're very clear on what each one does. Again, maybe think about putting together a little cheat sheet on them. We will, of course, link to the Congressional Research Service summary of them. And with that, we will move on and talk a little bit about framework and how we're going to frame this resolution in the round. Okay, so I think it's important to talk for a few minutes about the framing of the resolution and how different teams may approach this. I know that in PF we don't typically spend a lot of time at the top of the case reading a bunch of actual definitions like we might in Lincoln Douglas, because basically we just don't have time to do that, right? But that doesn't mean we don't have topicality fights. It doesn't mean we don't have fights about like what ground belongs to which team. Those happen all the time, right? And you want to be prepared for them. And to do that, I think we need to walk through what each of the individual terms means, right? So to start off with just end, I think it's pretty straightforward. End implies a permanent cessation. So you're not going to be able to run like a pause or a wait and see. It also means the absence of something. Like when you end something, it's gone. So I don't think the pro can advocate for some sort of reworking or reimagining of sanctions. Number one, because it's not topical. And number two, because like whatever you came up with would sound an awful lot like a plan. To be honest, this is kind of a disadvantage for the pro because a lot of the real world literature does talk about like scaling back sanctions, trying to reach some kind of compromise. And you really can't do that. I think as the pro, you do have to advocate for basically a complete and total end to whatever the sanctions are. So that's a little bit of a challenge for the pro and a little bit, I think, of an advantage for the con. So the second term is going to be economic sanctions, and there's a lot that we could potentially debate about here. I think there are sort of two questions. The first is, what are economic sanctions? And the second is, whatever they are, how many of them does the pro have to attack, right? So let's talk about what they are. I think the two sides in the debate are going to have very different versions of how we define economic sanctions. The con is going to want as broad a definition as possible because they want to make the pro defend getting rid of a whole bunch of different types of sanctions. Basically, they want to say, pro, your burden is to eliminate and end all 6 of the major types of sanctions that we just talked about in the overview a minute ago, right? Narcotics, individuals, targeted sanctions, not just general sanctions, right? And there is literature that the con can use very credibly to do that. Specifically, the Council on Foreign Relations in 2019 had a piece called What Are Economic Sanctions? And they say that basically it's withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations for foreign and security policy purposes. And they say that it can be focused on an entire country, like, for example, the Cuban embargo, or they may be targeted, blocking transactions by and with particular businesses, groups, or individuals. Well, the con likes that. That means that part of the pro's burden is looking at these targeted sanctions against narcotics traffickers and people who engage in human rights violations. The con thinks this definition is fantastic, right? It also says that since 9/11, there's been a shift toward targeted sanctions, and it says these include travel bans, asset freezes, arms embargoes, capital restraints, foreign aid reductions, and trade restrictions, right? So here again, we're talking about these individual asset freezes. You don't have to go in and block off a whole sector of the economy for it to meet the definition of an economic sanction. Con loves this because this means that there's a much broader set of sanctions that the pro is going to have to defend getting rid of, right? Now, the pro wants to do the opposite of that. The pro wants a narrow definition. They want to focus on the really egregious stuff that's hurting the Venezuelan people, like the ban on transactions with the state-owned oil company, right? Like the sort of general ban on financial services transactions in the finance sector, right? So Human Rights Watch in April 2019 had an article that looks specifically to the Venezuelan sanctions, and it has a nice little block quote. It says most sanctions, including some imposed by the United States, Canada, the EU, and several Latin American governments, are limited to canceling visas and freezing assets of key officials implicated in abuses and corruption. They in no way target the Venezuelan economy. So this position is going to basically say that if you're looking specifically to individuals and their assets as opposed to the country as a whole, that's not going to count as an economic sanction. And the pro's going to want to grab that like a life preserver and say, no, I don't have to go after any of these folks doing drug trafficking. I'm focused on the 2, 3, maybe 4 sanctions that are directly impacting the economy as a whole, right? The second question, though, is going to be whatever you decide the universe of economic sanctions is, does the pro in fact have to go after all of them, right? And this is a definitional argument that we've talked about before. Can the pro, for example, say, I don't have to advocate for getting rid of all economic sanctions, I can just pick 2 or 3. Economic sanctions, plural, doesn't say all economic sanctions, so I can just pick the 2 or 3 most egregious, or maybe even just the 2 most egregious and go after them. And as you've probably seen on this channel before, there's an argument that you cannot do that, right? And it's the idea of what we call a bare plural, right? A bare plural just means a noun that is plural that does not have a modifier like all, some, or most. And the general rule for bare plurals as a matter of linguistics and construction, as you may have heard us say before, is that they are interpreted as being categorical statements about the entire category of things. Particularly, now there are some exceptions to that, right? There are certainly contexts where that's not true, but particularly in rule-based statements, right, they are normally going to be interpreted as sort of categorical rules. So for example, if we say that students must be in their seats by the time the bell rings, that does not mean that if 2 students are in their seats, that the rule is satisfied. It means implicitly all students. And I think the con is going to argue that when we say economic sanctions as a bare plural, that means you've got to go after all economic sanctions, pro. And I think that's an important canon of construction just to kind of have in your debate repertoire. Frankly, it's not just about this resolution. We use bare plurals in so many debate resolutions. Both of the resolutions this month are using them. It's just something good to be able to understand and maybe write a block on if you ever have to get into a topicality fight on it, right? But there's another piece of language in the resolution which is against Venezuela that I think potentially further limits the universe of sanctions that we're talking about here, right? I think if you're the pro, you're going to want to seize on this language and say that the phrase against Venezuela means we are not debating about any sanctions against individual Venezuelans or even against like private companies in Venezuela. We are only talking about sanctions against the government as a whole, the country as a whole, maybe against state-owned enterprises like PDVSA, but we're not talking about the narcotics sanctions because those were against individuals and private companies, right? They are not against Venezuela, i.e. the country Venezuela. And the Khan will come back and say, no, look to the Council on Foreign Relations definition. They specifically say that one way we do economic sanctions against a country is to target their most important people, to target high-ranking government officials, and these are high-ranking government officials. But I think you have to be ready for this fight. Does the phrase against Venezuela rule these individual targeted sanctions out and mean that we are only debating about sanctions that apply to the government as a whole? Now, this is going to be a really important distinction to draw because, most of the sanctions that are doing the most harm to the Venezuelan people, as we'll see a little bit later, are going to be the ones that apply to the country as a whole, that apply to whole sectors of the economy, that apply to the government, that prevent them from having the ability to sell oil and import things that they need. By contrast, the more innocuous sanctions, the ones that really aren't harming the people that much and that frankly there may not be a strong reason to get rid of, are going to be the ones against individuals, drug traffickers, people who engage in human rights abuses. The argument would be, why in the world would we want to get rid of those? And it's going to be very important for both sides to be ready to fight about how we draw the line as to which ones of those sanctions belong in the debate and which ones don't. So get ready for that. And with that, we will move on to the part you've all been waiting for, which is the actual arguments, and there are plenty of them. So let's move on and talk about the pro. On the pro, there are a lot of great options, I think, for like discrete individual arguments. But I think before we get to those, because there are a lot of them, it's important to remember that the pro needs to have a coherent, succinct, clear story for the judge about why these sanctions are so bad. And I think almost without regard to what angles you take, the basic story of the pro goes like this and has to be told in a simple way like this. The basic problem with these sanctions is that they have very little chance of achieving their one stated goal of removing Nicolas Maduro. Number one, because sanctions historically do a terrible job at regime change. Their track record is really bad. Number two, because in this particular case, there's a lot of specific evidence that Maduro has already ridden out the worst of it and that there's very little chance of removing him now, and the chance goes down day by day. But what the sanctions are really good at is increasing the misery of the Venezuelan people. Nicolas Maduro sits comfortably in his palace, but the individuals, the people of Venezuela suffer, right? Executive Order 13808 does this by barring access to U.S. financial markets for Venezuela. Now, this might seem like it targets the government, but what it really does is prevents Venezuela from being able to get basic things like loans against its national debt. And because it can't get a loan, it can't pay for basic things like food and medicine. It can't pay for the parts needed to run its state oil company. And that state oil company is the lifeblood of the economy. It is the source of revenue, the overwhelming majority of revenue used to buy things like medicine and food to keep people alive. And when you don't allow it to have financing and don't allow it to get loans, it can't do that. People starve, people die, people become refugees. If that weren't enough, you hit it with a 1-2 punch of Executive Order 13850, which bars any U.S. purchases of oil of any kind from Venezuela's state-owned oil companies. Now, this again might seem like a good way of going after the government until you remember that in a petro-state like Venezuela, the vast majority of imports of food, medicine, and other essential supplies come from oil revenues. And when you tell them that they can't sell their oil, basically what you're saying is, we're going to try to affect regime change by starving you out. We're going to take away the one source of revenue that you use to buy food and medicine, and we're going to try to use that as leverage to get you, the Venezuelan people, to go and throw this guy out. That would be immoral and bad even if it worked, but as we showed you before, and as we're going to show you later, it doesn't work. And that's the core reason these sanctions don't work at achieving regime change. All they do, all they're good for, is killing Venezuelan people and making their lives miserable. And that's the core story that you're going to want to be telling. Now, with that, let's talk about the specific arguments that you can make on the pro. I think as a kind of a common sense matter, particularly for community type judges, one potential good starting point would be to say that the reasons the United States gave for the sanctions in the first place just don't make any sense. If you look to the stated rationale for the sanctions, and this is from an August 2017 press release by the White House, basically, the reasons they give for Executive Order 13808 are twofold. Number one, they say the Maduro dictatorship deprives the Venezuelan people of food and medicine. And then number two, they talk about how it has taken undemocratic actions by imprisoning people and basically not being a legitimate government. Okay, fair enough. So those are two reasons, harming the people and not a legitimate government, right? Are those valid reasons for the United States to implement sanctions and basically try to change a government regime? And the answer is is historically no, the United States does not do that. First of all, we do business and trade with undemocratic regimes all the time, right? We trade with China, which doesn't even pretend to be a democracy. We are a staunch ally and trade military hardware with Saudi Arabia. They don't pretend to be a democracy. They do repressive political things. They do violent things all the time. And we have no problem trading with them on a regular basis. We are not trying to change their regimes. So the idea that because a regime is corrupt, that the United States has a valid reason to go try to change it, no, we don't. We just don't behave that way. There's no country that behaves that way in the world. Number two, what about harm to the Venezuelan people, not having food and not having medicine? Well, that's a fair point. We certainly would like that to get better. But again, we don't go trying to do regime change just because a country is corrupt and does a bad job of meeting its people's needs. Look at places like Cambodia and Chad, right? These are corrupt, poor countries that do a terrible job meeting their people's needs, but we don't go trying to oust their government. We don't sanction them. We do trade with them, right? But even if you believe that that is a legitimate reason to do something, as we're going to show you later on, our sanctions are actually making the shortages of food and medicine worse. So I think from just a really practical perspective, especially for maybe like a lay or a community judge, saying that the two stated reasons we gave for doing this in the first place don't make sense. We don't go trying to change regimes just because they're not terribly democratic. We don't go trying to change regimes just because they do a poor job taking care of their people. That's just not how the United States operates. And as a matter of fact, in the long run, we're just going to end up making the problem worse. That's not a bad way to start a case. So I think when we start looking at the more scholarly approach to things on the pro, the biggest argument you're going to need to have in your back pocket, however you use it, is that economic sanctions have a terrible record of achieving their goals, particularly with respect to regime change, right? And there are a couple of ways to point this out. The first one would be just a basic common sense historical argument. Like Professor Frank O'Mara in January of 2018 writes, economic sanctions have largely failed when they've sought to compel the target country to take actions that threaten the regime's survival. For example, North Korea and Cuba have been among the most sanctioned countries in the world since the Cold War and have two of the most isolated and disastrous economies in the world, yet sanctions have not forced a course correction, right? And so he's just pointing out historically that not only do the sanctions not work in regime change, but in many cases, he talks about later in the article, they actually lead to a backlash. They lead in the other direction. They cause the regime to try to tighten their grip. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there's just no historical reason to think that economic sanctions are going to succeed in Venezuela where they failed in North Korea and in Cuba, right? Now, if you want a more scholarly approach, Robert Pape in 1997 wrote a really good piece called Why Economic Sanctions Do Not Work. And what he does is he looks at 115 cases of major economic sanctions being implemented globally in the 20th century. And he finds that contrary to prior estimates, only about 5 of them actually resulted in achieving their goals. And in 2 of those cases, it wasn't really clear that the country wouldn't have just gone ahead and done what the sanctioning country wanted them to do anyway. So it's a good empirical record that says it's very, very unlikely, as a percentage chance, it's very unlikely for economic sanctions to achieve regime change or to achieve their goals in general. More specifically, there's an article from Bahrami and Parsi in 2012 that we'll link to that explains that sanctions almost never lead to democratization, and how if the goal is democratization, typically you're more likely to see a backlash. You're more likely to see the dictator tighten their grip in the face of sanctions than do the opposite. But at the end of the day, whatever method you use on this sort of general point, what you say is, look, judge, at the end of the round, if you are on the fence about whether these sanctions will work, you need to play the odds, right? You need to make the smart bet. Look at the history of sanctions in general with respect to democratization, with respect to achieving their goals. Betting on sanctions to work is like betting on the Cleveland Browns to win the Super Bowl, right? Could it happen? I guess in theory, but statistically, it's not a smart bet. It almost never happens. And in this case, if you're not 100% certain that the con is right and that these sanctions are going to work, make the smart bet, play the odds, and vote pro, because these sanctions just will not work. Now, on a related note, I think it's important to remember for the pro that if Maduro doesn't leave, there is no point in having these sanctions in the first place, right? The single stated purpose for having sanctions against Venezuela was to get rid of the Maduro regime. That was it. And so if the con can't show you that he is likely to actually leave, there's no upside whatsoever to this. It's 100% downside for the people who are suffering under these sanctions. And even if they're only suffering just a tiny little bit, even if it's a trivial amount, there's still no reason to continue with the sanctions. And there are a couple of good ways to argue that Maduro is unlikely to step down, right? The first one was just the general unsuccessfulness of sanctions. sanctions. But more specific to Venezuela, right, is Maduro will never step down because Russia backs him. And this is an article from Borger in The Guardian in April of 2019, and he basically talks about how Nicolas Maduro actually had an airplane on the tarmac, back in early 2019, thinking about leaving the country, but was told by Russia, no, don't do this. We have bigger plans for you. And this source on this is not just some random person or some rumor. It's Mike Pompeo. The U.S. Secretary of State is going to be telling you that Russia said, no, Nicolas Maduro, don't leave Venezuela. We've got your back. We're going to support you. And that's what Maduro did. And you can pair that with a foreign policy article from the journal Foreign Policy in October 2019 that talks about how Russia is following up on what it said it would do. It's buying vastly more oil from Venezuela, giving them a lifeline there, helping their economy survive the sanctions. It's embedding troops with Venezuelan forces to help Maduro stay in power if push comes to shove. As I said earlier, it's looking at constructing an AK-47 factory in the country, right? So with the support of Russia, the argument would go, there's very little chance Maduro will step down. All of this is for nothing. All of the suffering you're seeing is for nothing. We need to end the sanctions. Another argument about why Maduro will never leave is because he has a perfect pressure release valve, which is refugees, right? Dave Lawler, writing in Axios in December 2019, points out that he's got this incredible escape valve that many dictators don't have. Usually the idea behind sanctions is the popular support against you will rise up and force you out of office, right? The problem, though, is that in Venezuela, you're seeing millions and millions of people, like multiple millions of people, cross the border into places like Colombia and try to get out of the country. If you really hate Maduro, if he's really making your life miserable, you're not likely to, join the rebellion or join the opposition party or even stick around and go to the polls and vote against him, which might not even be effective. What you're likely to do is leave. This is a pressure release valve, meaning that his strongest opponents are already leaving by the millions, and every day more of them leave, which means it's less and less likely that he will step down. And this creates a double impact for the pro. Number one is the likelihood of the sanctions working goes down with every refugee that leaves the country, because most of them presumably don't like Maduro, right? But number two, you're creating a refugee crisis. And there are plenty of impacts, and we'll link to those about how you're creating, that's its own distinct harm on the pro side, right? And this, I think, ties in nicely with a generally strong argument, which is that if sanctions haven't worked by now, they probably will never work. This has its roots in a general scholarly principle that the longer sanctions hang around, the more able the sanction party is to adapt and basically mitigate the damage from them. And Richard Haas at the Brookings Institution back in 1998 had a piece on the general ineffectiveness of sanctions, and what he basically says is that over time, what you're going to see is the sanctioned regime has time to look to other trading partners, to look to other economic resources, to consolidate its favor among key people like the military, whatever. And over time, this means that the impact of the sanctions gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And the argument would be this is exactly what is happening in Venezuela right now for multiple reasons. So number one, the argument would be the opposition party is faltering. The chief mechanism for regime change was supposed to be the opposition party under Juan Guaido. Remember, the Trump administration recognized Guaido as the legitimate interim president of Venezuela back in 2019, but unfortunately his opposition party is falling apart. They've been accused of corruption. They've had corruption scandals. Guaido himself has dropped by 20% in the polls, and you'll find plenty of quotes in some of these articles we link to saying they basically missed their moment. Their enthusiasm has ebbed. The tide has gone back out, and they really don't have the means to pressure Maduro out of office. If they ever did, it was probably back in 2019, and that ship has effectively sailed. In addition to that, not just domestically, but also, as we said earlier, now Maduro is getting help from external sources. So Yahoo Finance reports on December 31st, 2019, that China has resumed official oil dealings with PDVSA. China's imports jumped from 0 barrels to 200,000 barrels a day from Venezuela in December, pushing Venezuela's total exports back up to about 900,000 barrels per day for December. Now, that's nowhere near their historical high, but it's giving them a lifeline. Russia is doing the same thing. Rosneft, right? The Russian oil company, Russian-owned oil company, is doing the same thing. It's basically taking oil from Venezuela to pay off its debt. But worse than that for proponents of sanctions, it's not just buying oil by Russia and China, it's actually entering into partnerships to run the oil fields in Venezuela themselves, right? The New York Times on January 4th of 2020 reports that Venezuela's PDVSA is entering into agreements with Russian and Chinese companies, Rosneft and CNPC, to let those companies actually do the day-to-day operations of their oil fields. And the idea is what this will let them do is not only sell oil to China and Russia, but to effectively skirt the sanctions altogether, because the oil produced there will no longer be produced by any state-owned entity of Venezuela. It will be produced by Russia and China. Now, don't get me wrong, Russia and China will be paying money back to Venezuela to allow them to do that. But in theory, at least, the argument goes that this arrangement could allow third parties, other countries in the world, to buy Venezuelan oil, because it's technically not Venezuelan oil anymore. We'll have to see how that goes. But the bottom line here is what you have effectively done is you have seen Venezuela turn the corner. The decline of its domestic political opposition and the rise of support in Russia and China mean that the sanctions achieving their goal is less likely than ever. And also, an important note on this, the net effect of the sanctions so far, if you want to talk about an affirmative harm to the United States, is we are now taking this huge asset of Venezuelan oil that belonged to, frankly, a country that really couldn't harm the United States significantly, in Venezuela. Were they an opponent? Yes, to some extent, but they weren't a real threat. But now what you've done is back them into a corner and force them to sign over their oil to two countries that are major geostrategic rivals of the United States, Russia and China. Now they are the ones selling and profiting from this oil by actually running these oil fields, right? So you've gone from a situation where someone who was really not a rival had this asset to two countries that absolutely are our rivals having it, and that is a net negative for the United States, in addition to showing that the sanctions are unlikely to work. There is a related argument that is somewhat different, that even if you ignore the direct partnerships between Russia and China on the one hand and Venezuela on the other, that sanctions are a zero-sum game. And the more you sanction Venezuela, the more you help other bad actor states. So you're really not making the world any better overall. You're not even doing harm to U.S. adversaries overall. You're just shifting the benefits from one country to the other. And this comes from DePetris in August of 2019. And basically what he says is that in the time that the United States has been sanctioning Venezuela and reducing their ability to provide oil to the world, Russia has seen its sales of crude oil go up dramatically, right? Russia is a major geostrategic rival of the United States. And in particular, they've sold a lot more oil to China. The argument there would be we are driving Russia and China closer together. So not only are we benefiting one of our major geostrategic rivals, not some second-tier country like Venezuela, we're benefiting Russia, but we're also leading Russia to sell more oil to China, which cements their bond, right, and makes them, more unified in their opposition to the United States. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about how sanctions are unlikely to work, but there's another angle, which is let's assume they do work, right? History shows that there's a very good chance that things won't get better. They'll actually get worse in Venezuela, right? Because U.S. efforts at regime change around the world have a disastrous track record historically. And here again, you can look to evidence either on a sort of common sense historical level or on a more sort of analytical and scholarly level. On the common sense level, there's an article from Linker in 2018, and they write just basically, since the end of the Cold War, we've increasingly favored a more overt and aggressive policy of regime change, which is what we're doing here. We're trying to get rid of Maduro, right? First in Afghanistan, then in Iraq, then in Libya, and now possibly in Iran. Along the way, a loud chorus of people during the Obama administration clamored to get Syria added to this list. And the question is, have any of these acts of military destabilization turned out well for anyone? And the article goes on to explain, of course they haven't. Every time we try to change a regime, we end up in a quagmire, we end up in a disaster, we end up opening the country up to have even worse abuses by even worse governments. And there's absolutely no reason to think that Venezuela would be any different, especially since we see the opposition party that we like so much foundering in the polls. But there's just no reason to think that regime change ever consistently creates a more peaceful or democratic country based on anecdotal examples. But if you want a more scholarly approach, Pexon and Drury in 2010 have a really good article that examines the likelihood of increasing democratization after the use of sanctions to try to achieve regime change, right? They look specifically at cases where the United States uses economic sanctions to try to achieve political liberalization or a change in the regime. And they ask, do countries get more democratic or less democratic after we use economic sanctions? And here's the money quote from the article. Using the Freedom House regime measure, our model predicts a 7% reduction in the average political liberty score the year after the sender state initiated sanctions. The substantive effects of extensive and limited sanctions illustrate the much greater negative impact on political liberalization from extensive sanctions, and ours are certainly extensive sanctions, right? Specifically, limited sanctions cause only a 6% decline in democracy in target countries, while the democracy score drops by more than 16% when extensive sanctions are employed. So based on what you would argue, this is the best evidence in the round, it's a scholarly review of these things, we can predict that democracy will get worse in Venezuela after the use of economic sanctions and not better. And they even give a good explanation of the rationale. If you want a card on that, they basically say that sanctions give the regime an excuse to rally powerful people to their sides by doling out favors and scarce resources, and they give them a scapegoat to blame, and they basically give them a pretext to seize greater power over the country. And basically what ends up happening is economic sanctions that are intended to lead to democratization actually tend to backfire and lead to less democracy, both in the short run and in the long run. Now, obviously, a really important argument, I think, for pretty much every pro is going to be to argue that the sanctions are greatly exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And fortunately on this, I think you've got there's a lot of stuff you can say, but you've got a very easy go-to here, which is the Weisbrot and Sachs source from 2019 that we mentioned in the intro, right? That's going to be your go-to here. So if you read that, you're going to be able to cut all kinds of amazing cards on this, and what's really good is it's kind of a one-stop shop, right? The first thing you're going to have to show is that the sanctions are actually making these problems worse. Nobody really believes that the sanctions are the sole cause of the economic decline in Venezuela. They're obviously not. The decline started before any major sanctions were in place. But the argument would be that the sanctions are making them worse. They're taking an economy that was in decline and basically making it fall off a cliff. And they have some really good analytics for why that's the case. They make some very compelling cases for that. At the end of the day, it would be very hard for the judge to deny that cutting off the lifeblood of the economy in terms of oil exports was not making the economic situation worse. But they'll give you the sources and the quotes and things you need to be able to say that. Beyond that, though, they'll give you some really strong impacts on actual things like mortality, right? So they, for example, point to surveys about mortality rates, and they say that there was a 31% increase in general mortality in Venezuela from 2017 to 2018. In other words, what they say is 40,000 more people died from 2017 to 2018, which is a huge increase. I mean, you don't see a 31% increase in the number of people who die in a country unless something bad is happening. And the good thing about comparing 2017 to 2018 is it kind of controls for the suffering that was going on before the sanctions, right? Whatever the rate of death in Venezuela was before the major sanctions hit in 2017, right? Well, that was already baked into the cake. Whatever was happening as a result of the Maduro regime, that was already in the mortality rate for 2017. So when they compare 2017 to 2018 and we see a 40,000 death increase, there is a very strong argument that they say at least a significant portion of those increased deaths have to be as a result of U.S. sanctions, because that's the only thing that really dramatically changed from 2017 to 2018. It's not a perfect argument. As they point out in their article, you can never say for certain like what would have happened in the world had there been no sanctions, but that's as close to a true apples to apples comparison as you're going to get. It makes common sense, right? And it's really good. And then beyond that, I could sit here and tell you all of the things they say about, HIV treatments, malnutrition, weight loss, infant mortality. They just sort of go down the list on impact. So you're going to be able to find a lot of tremendous impacts there. Again, packaged in with the argument that these are the result of the sanctions, right? The only thing to be aware of is, Weisbrot obviously is a public supporter of the regime in at least the Hugo Chavez regime in Venezuela. So there may be some credibility questions there, but generally speaking, I think they're credible researchers. The fact that they have political opinions does not mean that their numbers are wrong, right? So I think that's really strong. So clearly there's a lot of good stuff you can run on this. You can sort of take your pick. So just get to work on that, because I think it's a key part of pretty much any case. Now, when we turn to harms to the United States, there are a lot of different ways you can do this, but one of my favorites is that reliance on sanctions generally erodes the dominance of the US dollar, right? So in the status quo right now, the dollar is what we call the de facto reserve currency for the entire world. Basically, it's the currency that you can use to do pretty much any major international transaction, right? Any major transaction that's going to happen, you can certainly do it with dollars, which means that countries, private entities, businesses, governments, they all buy a large number of dollars and hold it as a reserve currency, right, so that they can be able to perform these transactions. And this has huge benefits for the United States. There's a really good argument from Smart 2018 for the Carnegie Endowment that explains that like having the dollar be the reserve currency for the whole world gives us all kinds of benefits. It gives us the prospect to literally print money anytime we want, like in a war. We can increase the size of our military without giving up, for example, meeting civilian needs. We can shift the costs of global recessions and things like that to other countries in some cases. We get essentially a no interest loan from folks because they're holding our dollars. It's all complex financial stuff, but the bottom line is there are big economic benefits to the United States from having the dollar be the de facto currency, right? But Daniel McDowell in December 2019 has an article about how sanctions overreach can undermine the dollar. And the basic argument is the more we use sanctions where we basically freeze your assets in the United States, we freeze your dollar assets, the more other countries are going to look and say, I'm not so sure I want to keep all of my or a big portion of my currency reserves in the United States, in US banks, in dollars. If the United States is going to go around the world and use dollars and use their economy as a means to sort of force people to do what they want, I'm not sure I want to be subject to that pressure. And what McDowell says in the article is that many countries are looking aggressively to other currencies, right, and undermining the dominance of the dollar. Maduro specifically said he would do it, and other world leaders are contemplating it as well. And this is just a good argument to sort of generally say, sanctions always come with a cost, right? Even if you don't perceive an immediate cost to the United States today, even if our economy is trucking along just fine, the more you overuse sanctions, the more you undermine people's willingness to use the US dollar as the sort of de facto currency, the coin of the realm, right, to do economic transactions around the world. So every time if they're not doing any good, you shouldn't be doing them at all because it's never costless. It always comes with a potential cost. And then lastly, I guess is kind of a defensive point for the pro, the idea that exceptions to the sanctions and humanitarian aid are not going to be enough to prevent the harm, right? So you're going to see some cons come in and say, oh, don't worry about harms to human rights. Don't worry about lack of food. That's not the fault of the sanctions. The sanctions contain exceptions. And also you've got humanitarian aid that's coming in from all these countries. And there are very strong responses to that. The reason why the sanctions are harming Venezuelan people so much is not because food or medicine is banned. We know that under the 2019 sanctions, OFAC is allowed to make exceptions and let food and medicine in. But that's not the issue. The issue is the sanctions have destroyed Venezuela's economy. They have prevented it from selling oil. They have prevented it from getting loans to continue the government operating. And as a result, even though they are allowed to buy food and medicine, they don't have the money to buy them. So these exceptions that don't prohibit food from coming in don't solve the problem, which is you've destroyed the economy to such an extent that they cannot purchase the things they need because oil is their source of revenue and they no longer have that anymore. And then in addition to that, there's a really good article from the Financial Times that just points out that humanitarian aid is just a fraction of what is needed. We're talking about millions of dollars as opposed to billions of dollars that are needed to meet the needs of food and medicine and supplies and things like that for the Venezuelan economy. So it would be really good to have a block on that because I can definitely see some con teams coming in and saying, oh no, don't worry, there are exceptions for all that. And the answer is the exceptions don't matter because they don't have the money to buy the stuff they need anyway. So anyway, with that, a lot of good stuff on the pro. I think a lot of different angles to come at it. Like I said, it's a really practical topic. I think the more you know about the day-to-day hands-on about how these things work within Venezuela, the better able you'll be to kind of cut the links on some of the more esoteric arguments. So with that, let's turn and take a look at the con. Okay, so on the con, as always, you certainly need to have a clear, straightforward narrative for what you're asking the judge to vote for, right? It's arguably even more important on the con than the pro. And I think what you say is really sort of twofold. The first thing is, it is not the con's duty to defend the status quo, right? We do not have to persuade you that every variant of sanctions is good or perfect or should not be changed, or even some of them shouldn't be eliminated. Instead, the pro has the heavy burden of showing you, judge, that 6 different types of sanctions that we're going to talk to you about, right? Or however many you say, some of these subvariants, all of them need to be gone entirely. Now, if you at the end of the round believe that some of them are actually okay, they're not so bad, and a few of them are bad, maybe we should get rid of them, that's not a vote to end sanctions. At most, that's a vote to modify or reduce. So if you're thinking at the end of the round there are some good sanctions and some bad sanctions, that is a vote for the con, right? Now, obviously, to do this, we're going to need to have a broad definition of what an economic sanction is. So we're going to be relying on the Council of Foreign Relations definition, whether we read it in the round or not. But at the end of the day, what you're going to be saying is, look, we have multiple types of sanctions. Some of them are against really bad, corrupt, violent individuals, right? And sometimes they result in these people flipping and helping us push Maduro out. And sometimes we just freeze their assets. So, for example, government officials involved in drug cartels can't use their money to prop up Maduro, or state intelligence agencies, which have been sanctioned, can't use their money to kill political opponents. And the pro has to show you, right, that all of these things, freezing these assets of these terrible people, should end. Full stop, period. And these cronies and murderers and folks should just get all their money back, and they should just be allowed to travel freely. And the con is a world where we say, let's look at it on a case-by-case basis. Maybe we think one or two of the sanctions is bad, but maybe some of them are justified. And if at the end of the round, Judge, you think we should be looking at these sanctions on a case-by-case basis, that is not a vote to end them. That is a vote for the con, right? The second thing you want to try to sell the judge on is the idea that the misery of the Venezuelan people is not the fault of the sanctions, right? Just chronologically, just to keep it simple for the judge, this decline in Venezuela, these shortages of food and medicine, malnutrition, things like that, they all began long before the main sanctions took effect. They all got really bad before the sanctions took effect. And you're going to want to try to sell the judge on the idea that it's not the sanctions that are causing them, it is the Hugo Chavez and later on Maduro regime. Right? This regime that makes terrible choices, that mismanages the economy. There's no reason to think if we just walk away and let them have the reins of the economy back unfettered, that anything different is going to happen. They crashed the economy before, they'll crash the economy again. If you're worried about the suffering of the Venezuelan people, the most important thing you can do is to remove Maduro. And even if you don't think there's a 100% chance that we're going to do that, any chance of doing that is something you ought to vote for in this round, because if you don't, there is no chance of returning to a world in which Venezuela is prosperous and people don't suffer like this. So I think those are sort of the two core theory arguments that most cons are going to want to have in their cases. Now let's talk about some of the specific points that you can make in your case. So I think just to kind of carry over what we were saying a second ago, one of the best core arguments, I think, for almost any con is to just start listing different sanctions that are innocuous for which there's no reason to get rid of them, and just say, Judge, if at the end of the round I can give you one or two or three of these, and the pro can't show you why we should get rid of it specifically, that means you're not ending sanctions and you can vote for the con, right? In fact, I can absolutely imagine a con case that consists of a team just picking like 6 different sanctions and putting short little warrants as to why they're good, and reading that as their con case and just daring the pro to go after all of them. And then whichever ones they don't spend time on, you come back and say, okay, Judge, well, on these 3, they didn't give you really any good response. They didn't tell you any compelling reason why to get rid of them. And that means there are at least 3 sanctions that are good, so you can't vote to end sanctions as a category. Now, what that means is you need to start brainstorming and thinking about which of the sanctions are sort of the most sympathetic. You can certainly do that on your own. I do have some ideas there. So first of all, the narcotics trafficking sanctions that began back in 2006. I think there's a strong case, if you use the Council on Foreign Relations definition, that this is an economic sanction, right? Selling narcotics is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We are trying to prevent freezing the assets of people involved in that industry. But more importantly, the kingpins of these cartels overwhelmingly are people that are heavily connected to the Maduro regime, right? They're people who are able to funnel money and favors and support to Maduro, right? And when we take their assets out of circulation, we're taking away money that goes directly to supporting and propping up the regime. So I think that is a core economic sanction, or at least you can make that argument. And the idea would be to say, why would we ever want to give these people their money back? We're not necessarily claiming here that these sanctions are stopping like the sale of cocaine. They're not. What we're saying is we're taking these illicit assets that they have through corruption, that they use to prop up Maduro, that they use in many cases to help him continue to oppress his people, and we're just trying to take them out of circulation. And even if it's just like $1, it might not be very much, but if it's any amount, why would we want to give that back to these drug traffickers who are also government officials. And I think that's a strong argument. The second one would be to look at the terrorism sanctions from back in 2006. These bar the sale of weapons to Venezuela. So first of all, they're clearly against Venezuela, right? But the argument would be they're clearly economic as well, because buying weapons is a multi-million, potentially multi-billion-dollar transaction, and we are barring it from happening. And with a regime that was actively engaged in extrajudicial killings, that is trying to suppress and repress its opponents, why in the world would we want to get rid of a rule that tells U.S. arms manufacturers and our allies who own our arms that they can't sell them to Venezuela? What possible reason would we have for allowing that to happen? If you win that it's an economic sanction, it's very sympathetic. A third option would be individual human rights and corruption sanctions. These are the ones that look to individuals who've done things to suppress human rights. There are plenty of specific examples if you want to look to those. The New York Times, for example, had an article about Maduro's relatives and business partners, and he himself, stealing money and stealing food from state food services companies while people are starving. And the question would be, why should we unfreeze their assets? Why should we give money back to people who were literally stealing from starving people, right? In addition, some of these sanctions against individual folks have worked to turn key players in the regime to the U.S. side. Specifically, there's a former head of Venezuela's intelligence service, Manuel Christopher Figuera, I believe is how you say it, who fled Venezuela, came to the U.S., and is now providing valuable intelligence. If there's any chance of turning these folks to our side, why would we not do it? They're overwhelmingly bad folks who have been complicit or active in repressing human rights and in some cases just killing folks. So why not? Why unfreeze their assets? Why give them back? And then the last sort of category of choices would be some of these targeted sector sanctions, right? So one good one, for example, was sanctions that were imposed under EO 13850 on Venezuela's military counterintelligence agency. And this comes from an article in U.S. News. And it basically says the United States has frozen the assets of Venezuela's military counterintelligence agency because they were involved in the arrest, torture, and killing of Captain Rafael Acosta, who's a U.S. soldier who was involved in supporting the opposition movement in that country. And so, if they're going to be killing U.S. personnel, why in the world would we give them money back so they can do that more efficiently, especially when this would certainly not be the first killing this organization has been involved in? Remember, this is something that was happening frequently back in 2014 and 2015. So there are a lot of good options for how we can say, Judge, even if you kind of think that maybe some of these big ones like the petroleum company or whatever should go away, I'm going to give you a laundry list of ones that shouldn't. And those give you clear, clean reasons why you can vote for the con, because you're not getting rid of the sanctions. You're just mitigating and reducing them maybe. So I think another really important thing that all cons probably need to do in their case is push back on the notion that sanctions cause the misery of the Venezuelan people. Right? I think you need to affirmatively argue that it is not the sanctions that do this, that in fact there is clear evidence that it's Maduro, that the suffering had begun and had gotten really, really serious before the sanctions ever came into play. And I think there are sort of two tiers to this. There's the mandatory tier that you have to do, and then there's the optional tier where you're sort of going for more offense. The mandatory tier is to at least fight to a stalemate, right? You cannot let the pro have the monopoly on this and read the wise broad evidence and argue that, yes, all of this suffering is a result of the sanctions. You absolutely have to push back on that. And we're going to talk in a second about how to do that. But beyond that, there's another tier that I think is a really good one, which is if you can persuade the judge, right, that these harms, these economic harms, these shortages, this malnutrition, all of these deaths, the refugee crisis, things like that, these are all the result of Maduro's policies, right? The Chavez policies carried over to Maduro, the choices he's made, the bad mismanagement that he's engaged in, then your argument becomes kind of a turn. You say, look, the reason this suffering is happening is because Maduro's in office. The only way to effectively stop it is to get rid of him. He's the one who crashed the economy. If we just pack up and leave and get rid of all of these sanctions and let him go back to what he was doing, he's going to crash the economy again. He's the one who made the choices that got us here, right? And there are multiple different warrants and approaches you can do with this. The first one is there is argument that famine and shortages are largely because Maduro is actively rejecting aid in the present tense. So NPR in February of 2019 noted that there are hundreds of millions of dollars in food, medical supplies, and other humanitarian aid that has been pre-positioned in Colombia, right, ready to go to the people of Venezuela, and Maduro actively blocks it because he doesn't want people to, see outside forces like the United States as their salvation. And there's a really good, photograph in one of these articles of a highway bridge literally blocked off with semi-trucks so that aid cannot come into Venezuela. It's a very striking picture. This may not be the biggest argument in scope, but it does have a kind of a gut level resonance for many judges. Another argument would be that Maduro actually has many basic necessities. He's just hoarding them for his supporters. So Human Rights Watch has an article, this is from back in 2018, but you can still get some mileage out of it, which is that Maduro actually does have access to food and basic supplies. But what he does is, instead of putting them out there in grocery stores where they can be like sold, which is what they're intended to be done, sell them at some price so that people need them, who need them can buy them, he actually just gives them to his loyalists, or he allows the military to distribute them, meaning that only loyalists get them. So he is using the supplies that he has rather than giving them to people who need them to basically shore up his own power, right? Now, these are two sort of good quick hit anecdotes about mismanagement by Maduro, but I think even more important than that is going to be to sort of address the core argument of why the economy is declining over the long run, right? To sort of hit back on the Weisbrot argument that the sanctions are doing the bulk of the damage. And luckily, there's a lot of good evidence out there, including articles that directly challenge Weisbrot and Sachs, the very important piece we talked about earlier, and say, no, it was not the sanctions that are causing the misery of these folks. It is the mismanagement of the Maduro regime. So Hausman and Muci in May 2019 do a great article. It's a direct rebuttal to Weisbrot and Sachs, and they basically say, yes, oil production did continue to go down after the sanctions, but the sanctions weren't the reason. The reason was because Maduro was a terrible manager who replaced the competent directors of the state-run oil company with a military general who promptly fired and imprisoned like 60 of the top managers, right? They point out how overall oil production, if you look at it, in Venezuela has been declining since 1998 when Hugo Chavez came to power. It did not start, and it honestly didn't even accelerate all that much in 2017 or 2018. So these declines that we see are part of an overall decline in the economic performance of Venezuela as a result of these bad populist policies and maybe the decline of oil prices in general. They also talk about how this idea that barring access to financial markets is not the reason why Venezuela can't get a loan. In 2017, before those sanctions were even put in place, Venezuela had to pay $2.8 billion over 5 years to get a $900 million loan. So they had to pay over 3 times as much in interest just to get a loan. And this was before the sanctions ever took effect. So the global financial markets had basically told them, your borrowing is unsustainable. You're not going to be able to continue doing it, right? So in addition to Hausman and Muci, there's another article, a similar critique of Weisbrot and Sachs from the Brookings Institution in 2019. And what they do is they also just sort of walk through and talk about how you've seen massive percentage declines in food imports, in calorie intake, in all of these humanitarian things that happened before the sanctions were in place. And I think it's really, really important for you as the con to come in and say, these disasters are not caused by the sanctions. The sanctions might have accelerated them just a tiny little bit, but they are the continuation of the free fall of the incompetent management of the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime before them. And as a result, if you want to stop this, if you want to keep people from suffering, you've got to get rid of the guy who flew the economy into the ground in the first place. If we leave, he's not suddenly going to become a competent manager who actually knows how to restore the wealth of the Venezuelan people. And I think that is an extremely important argument that all cons need to engage in and try to win. And a related argument kind of similar to this, maybe just a different way of phrasing it, is the idea that sanctions really aren't hurting anybody but the elites. And this is a much easier argument to make if you win the idea that we're talking about these individual sanctions, right? But it's an argument you can make either way. So Vidal and Mazzali, writing for PRI in January 2019, quote a bunch of sources in Venezuela, sort of experts and partisans and people with opinions. And they basically just have some language that explains that these are high-ranking government officials that have fortunes in their bank accounts, properties in foreign countries, and these sanctions have debilitated their ability to move around internationally, have reduced their standard of living. These sanctions have absolutely nothing to do with hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages. They have everything to do with limiting these bad actors' ability to make the situation worse. And this is just a sort of a different flavor of the argument that, it is the Maduro regime that is at fault here, and it is not the sanctions that are hurting regular people. Another point where you're going to want to, I think, hit right back at the pro and kind of have some direct clash on an important issue is the idea that sanctions can and do sometimes lead to democratic progress. If you remember on the pro, we talked about how there's a lot of scholarly evidence that sanctions typically don't work. Sometimes they backfire. But the good news for the con is there's actually some current evidence now that suggests the opposite of that sanctions can be effective. So, for example, von Soest, Christian, and Wahmann, 2014, I think that's how you say it. We had a lot of interesting names in this video, and I butchered them all. I apologize. But von Soest and others argue that new data, more current data, shows that economic sanctions aimed at pro-democratic goals actually can be very effective in some cases. And they note that Pape, remember we talked about Pape earlier, had the contrary conclusion, but they say that their data is more recent. It's from 1990 through 2010. And one of the things that they find basically is that in many cases, targeted sanctions, depending on what the goal is, can lead to certain specific democratic goals, right? And I won't get into the numbers because they get complicated, but they have lots of nice charts and a few block quotes, and we're certainly going to link to them. And you can use them for the idea that the best, most current evidence is that sometimes targeted sanctions actually do lead to democratization. I think that another somewhat creative set of arguments is the idea that now is the wrong time, right? If you can establish that the pro has to advocate for a prompt removal of sanctions, you can argue not necessarily that the sanctions are inherently good or that they might not be proven bad, but that it is premature. Right? It is too early to do this. We need to give the sanctions a proper opportunity to see if they will be successful. This is a little bit of a squirrel argument. I probably wouldn't run a whole case on it, but it might be a nice third contention in a case that looks to other things to kind of have a change of pace and force your opponent to defend a lot more. And there are several variations on it. One is the idea that we haven't given the new plan sufficient time to work. Allison Fedrika in Geopolitical Futures in September 2019 basically points out that in late 2019 or midway through, we kind of changed strategies in Venezuela. Rather than throwing our full support behind the Juan Guaido opposition and hoping that he would win, we instead started negotiating directly with members of the Maduro regime, and in some cases even back-channel discussions with Maduro himself. Rudy Giuliani was apparently on a call attempting to persuade Maduro to give up. And the idea is this is a relatively new strategy, but what it is, the argument is that some members of the Maduro regime are starting to see the writing on the wall. They're starting to look for avenues for themselves to get out, maybe to pressure Maduro to give up and leave. And we really haven't given this new strategy time to work. We need to give it a reasonable amount of time. We can't just say 4 months into it, we're going to give up on it without giving it sufficient time. Another one is the idea that the worst time to quit is when the pressure's starting to work. So Antonio Maria Delgado in the Miami Herald in December of 2019 points out that Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro has isolated key members of his governing coalition, have secretly begun searching for their exit strategy, with some ready to oust him if it gains them safe passage out of the current crisis. So you've got some people who are starting to break ranks. If you can sell the judge on the idea that we're just about over the goal line, give it time to work, we can come back in 6 months and reassess this, that might be another way to gain some offense. And the other would be the worst time to quit is when both sides are signaling possible compromise. So this comes from Politico, actually just a few days ago, January 5th of 2020, and it basically says in the article that both the U.S. and Venezuela are signaling a willingness to compromise. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, has just said that what we want is free and fair elections. And if the Chavistas win, right, Maduro's party wins, right, then we'll accept it, right? And Maduro is now tweeting that he is willing to meet with Trump and outline a plan for fixing relations. Well, this is as close as the two sides have gotten really ever, right, since this began. So if we've got one side saying all we want is fair elections and the other saying I'm willing to sit down and talk with Trump to try to repair relations, you know, granted there are certain counter signals to that, obviously, but if you can get the judge to accept that we might be right on the cusp of something, then you can just circumvent almost all of the other impacts and say, look, give it a few months. Let's see what happens, right? Even if you buy everything that they're saying on the pro, we might be this close to getting what we want and getting rid of this jerk, right? So just give it a little bit of time. It's a creative argument, wouldn't base a whole case around it, but I certainly think it is worth considering. And I think the last argument is to just consider sort of a rights-based argument, right? Maybe more of a Lincoln Douglas style value-based argument about basic human rights, right? And I don't, again, necessarily have specific, highly precise warrants on this, but the idea would be to look at things like the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and I'll link to a page that has, a description of those things. And you basically just cite whatever your favorite evidence is about how Maduro systematically violates those rights. He rigs elections, he kills off political opponents. Recently, he's tried to physically bar the opposition party from entering the National Assembly to hold votes. And the notion would be you just say this is a fundamental thing. This is not subject to negotiation. This is more important even than a little bit of suffering over the short term. If you believe you have a judge that would listen to that sort of more philosophical or theoretical approach to things, I do think it can be viable. Again, might not base a whole case on it, but I do think talking about fundamental rights is something that you absolutely can viably do on the con. So with that is the con. As I said earlier, I think it's a little bit of an uphill battle. I think the pro has a little bit of an advantage, but overall, I think it will be a generally balanced debate. And so with that, we will move on to some quick final thoughts. Final thoughts on the resolution are these. It's an important topic. Nationally speaking, a lot of big tournaments. Some of you may also have qualifiers for NSDA. Those of you who are going to NCFL and that league may have qualifiers for that. And locally and regionally, a lot of big tournaments as well. So this is a topic where specific knowledge is really going to pay, right? Like we said earlier, and current knowledge is really going to pay. And little granular bits of information are going to help you get the better of opponents who only understand it on a sort of broad theoretical level. So certainly I think the return on investment in terms of the work that you put in is going to be as high on this one as it is on any topic. There is no way to just sort of brute force your way through this with one magical site that's going to win the round for you. It's just a matter of amassing as much information and knowledge and being as articulate as you possibly can on it. So anyway, I want to wish you guys the best of luck. If you do have great conquests out there, if you win big using the stuff or not using the stuff, let us know in the comments. We always love to hear about how well you're doing. That's the point of the channel. We will see you on the February topic about universal basic income. And until then, I will sign off with my usual, have fun, work hard, and hail safe.